Long before modern psychology, before science explained the universe, and before people learned to speak openly about anxiety, there lived a philosopher who made a shocking claim. Human beings are not unhappy because life is cruel, but because they are afraid of things that do not deserve fear. He taught that even death should not frighten us, that wealth often destroys peace instead of creating it, and that happiness can be achieved with almost nothing at all. While empires chased power and glory, Epicurus quietly built a garden where people came not to become famous or wise in the eyes of society, but to learn how to live without anxiety. His ideas were so misunderstood that history would later accuse him of teaching pleasure and excess, when in truth, he was trying to solve the deepest problem of human existence: how to live calmly in a world filled with uncertainty. Epicurus was born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, during one of the most psychologically unsettled periods in Greek history. Only a generation earlier, the world of independent Greek city-states had begun to dissolve under the enormous expansion created by Alexander the Great. Traditional civic life, which once gave citizens identity and purpose, was weakening. Political decisions were increasingly made far away by monarchs ruling vast territories. Ordinary individuals no longer felt that public life belonged to them. This shift created a quiet but profound anxiety across the Greek world. Philosophy itself began changing direction, moving away from questions about ideal governments or heroic virtue toward a more intimate concern. How can a human being live peacefully when the world feels unstable and beyond personal control? Epicurus would devote his entire life to answering this question. His parents, Neocles and Cheristrate, were Athenian citizens who had settled on Samos as colonial migrants. His father earned a modest living as a schoolteacher, and this environment meant that Epicurus grew up surrounded by education rather than wealth. From childhood, he encountered poetry, grammar, and early philosophical discussions. Unlike many later philosophers who emerged from aristocratic privilege, Epicurus experienced ordinary social insecurity. This background shaped his lifelong suspicion toward ambition, competition, and political striving. He saw early that social status rarely guaranteed peace of mind. Ancient accounts suggest that Epicurus began questioning religious explanations of the universe at a young age. Traditional Greek religion described gods who intervened unpredictably in human affairs, rewarding or punishing according to divine moods. Rather than comforting him, these stories produced unease. If powerful supernatural beings governed existence arbitrarily, human life seemed permanently vulnerable. This emotional reaction became the starting point of his philosophy. He did not begin by asking abstract, metaphysical questions. He began with fear. Why are human beings afraid? And can understanding remove that fear? At the age of 18, Epicurus traveled to Athens to complete military training required of Athenian citizens. Athens still carried the intellectual legacy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, though its political dominance had faded. Philosophical schools remained active, yet the atmosphere had changed. Earlier generations debated how citizens should govern themselves collectively. Now thinkers increasingly focused on how individuals could maintain stability within large empires they could not influence. Epicurus absorbed this cultural transition deeply, though he did not attach himself permanently to any existing school. After his military service, political changes forced Athenian settlers from Samos, separating Epicurus from the environment of his childhood. He joined his family in Asia Minor, beginning years of travel and intellectual formation. During this period, he studied under several teachers and encountered competing philosophical traditions. Among the most influential was the atomist philosophy associated with Democritus. Atomism proposed that all reality consists of tiny indivisible particles moving through empty space according to natural laws. Thunder, earthquakes, celestial motion, and life itself required no mythological explanation. Nature operated through material processes. For Epicurus, this idea carried enormous psychological significance. If natural events occur through understandable causes rather than divine anger, then fear of supernatural punishment loses its foundation. Philosophy could become a form of liberation rather than speculation. Yet Epicurus also recognized a problem within earlier atomism. If atoms moved entirely according to rigid necessity, then human freedom would disappear. Every action would be predetermined. To preserve moral responsibility and personal agency, Epicurus proposed that atoms occasionally deviate slightly from straight motion in unpredictable ways. This subtle deviation introduced openness into the universe, allowing genuine choice to exist within a natural world. By his early 30s, Epicurus began teaching independently. He first attempted to establish philosophical communities in Mytilene and later in Lampsacus. These early efforts were not always smooth. Reports suggest controversy and resistance from established intellectual circles. Yet Epicurus gradually attracted devoted followers who were less interested in intellectual rivalry and more interested in practical guidance for living well. His teaching style differed markedly from other philosophers. He avoided aggressive debate and instead emphasized calm explanation, personal friendship, and emotional reassurance. Around 306 BCE, Epicurus returned permanently to Athens and made the defining decision of his life. Rather than joining Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, he purchased a modest house with a garden on the outskirts of the city. This location became known simply as the Garden, and it represented a quiet revolution in philosophical practice. The garden was not structured like a competitive academy. It functioned as a living community. Epicurus invited students to share daily life rather than attend formal lectures alone. Meals were simple and communal. Conversation replaced public disputation. Women were admitted as participants in philosophical discussion, an unusual practice in Greek intellectual culture. Enslaved individuals were welcomed as members of the philosophical community. Social hierarchy was deliberately minimized. What mattered was the shared pursuit of tranquility. Life within the garden reflected Epicurus's developing ethical vision. He rejected luxury not because pleasure was evil, but because dependence creates anxiety. Expensive tastes require constant effort to maintain. Political ambition exposes individuals to rivalry and danger. Fame subjects happiness to public opinion. Epicurus observed that people often increase suffering while attempting to secure happiness. The more they desire without limit, the more fragile their peace becomes. He began articulating a radical reinterpretation of pleasure. Earlier critics and later misunderstandings would portray him as advocating indulgence, but his understanding was disciplined and precise. The highest pleasure, he taught, is the stable condition achieved when physical pain is absent and the mind is free from disturbance. Intense excitement is temporary and often followed by discomfort. Lasting happiness comes from calm satisfaction, modest living, and emotional security. Central to his teaching was the analysis of desire. Epicurus distinguished between desires that are natural and necessary, such as food, shelter, and companionship, and those that are natural but unnecessary, such as luxury or refinement. Beyond these lie empty desires for power, fame, or unlimited wealth, which have no natural endpoint. Because they cannot be fully satisfied, they produce endless anxiety. By understanding which desires truly matter, individuals can dramatically reduce suffering. Fear of the gods and fear of death, he believed, were the two greatest sources of human unrest. Epicurus argued that divine beings, if they exist, must live in perfect tranquility and therefore would have no reason to interfere in human affairs. As for death, he reasoned that all good and bad experiences require sensation. Death is the absence of sensation. Therefore, it cannot harm us. When we are alive, death is not present, and when death occurs, we no longer exist to experience it. Removing fear of death allows life to be lived fully in the present. Friendship became the emotional center of the garden. Epicurus believed friendship provides safety greater than wealth or political power. Trusted companions reduce fear and create stability. Letters between Epicurean communities show how seriously this principle was practiced. Philosophy was not an individual achievement, but a shared way of living. During these early Athenian years, Epicurus worked continuously to refine his teachings into clear and accessible forms. He rejected obscure language, insisting that philosophy should be understandable to ordinary people. Knowledge of nature, discipline of desire, and cultivation of friendship together formed a path toward inner freedom. The garden slowly became known across the Greek world as a place where philosophy promised not fame or intellectual dominance, but peace. At this point in his life, Epicurus stood at the height of creative energy. His community was growing, his ideas were spreading through students and correspondence, and his philosophical project was evolving into a complete vision of how human beings might live without fear in an uncertain world. The foundations have been laid, but the full development of his thought and the challenges that would test it still lay ahead. As the community of the garden matured in Athens, Epicurus entered the most productive and intellectually expansive period of his life. What had begun as a small circle of companions slowly transformed into one of the most influential philosophical movements of the Hellenistic world. Students arrived not only from Athens, but from distant regions across Greece and Asia Minor, drawn by the promise of a philosophy that did not demand withdrawal into abstract speculation, but offered practical relief from anxiety. Unlike rival schools that emphasized public debate or intellectual prestige, the garden functioned almost like a therapeutic community devoted to reshaping how its members understood life itself. Daily life within the garden followed rhythms intentionally designed to cultivate stability. Meals were modest, often consisting of bread, olives, vegetables, and water. Epicurus famously taught that luxury was unnecessary for happiness and often harmful because it trained individuals to depend on circumstances beyond their control. He argued that a person who learns to enjoy simple food can experience pleasure equal to that of kings while remaining immune to disappointment when fortune changes. This discipline was not ascetic rejection of pleasure, but strategic independence. By reducing needs, one increases freedom. Epicurus spent much of his time writing and corresponding with followers who had established Epicurean communities elsewhere. He composed numerous treatises on physics, ethics, perception, and cosmology, reportedly filling hundreds of scrolls. Though most of these works were lost over time, surviving letters and fragments reveal his method clearly. He believed philosophical teaching must be repeated and simplified so that essential truths could be remembered during moments of fear or distress. Philosophy was meant to function almost like medicine carried within the mind, ready whenever anxiety arose. A central focus of his teaching during this period was the study of nature. Epicurus believed that ignorance about natural phenomena generated unnecessary terror. Thunderstorms, eclipses, earthquakes, and disease were commonly interpreted as signs of divine anger. Such beliefs left people feeling powerless before unseen forces. Epicurus insisted that understanding natural causes dissolves fear. He explained celestial movements, weather patterns, and physical processes through atomistic principles, emphasizing that multiple natural explanations were often possible. What mattered was not identifying one absolute cause, but recognizing that supernatural punishment was unnecessary as an explanation. This approach fundamentally altered the purpose of scientific inquiry. For Epicurus, knowledge of nature served emotional liberation. Once individuals understood that the universe operates according to natural processes rather than divine wrath, they could live without constant dread. The gods, he maintained, exist in perfect tranquility and therefore do not interfere in human life. To imagine divine beings consumed with anger or judgment was to project human insecurity onto perfection itself. At the same time, Epicurus refined his ethical teaching concerning pleasure and pain. He distinguished between moving pleasures and stable pleasures. Moving pleasures arise when a desire is actively being satisfied, such as eating when hungry or drinking when thirsty. Stable pleasure, however, exists once discomfort has been removed and the body rests in equilibrium. This stable condition, free from physical pain and mental disturbance, represented the highest form of happiness. Excitement and excess were unnecessary because tranquility provided deeper and more lasting satisfaction. Mental disturbance, which he called turmoil of the soul, concerned him more than bodily pain. Anxiety about the future, regret over the past, envy of others, and fear of death disrupted inner peace even when material conditions were comfortable. Epicurus, therefore, trained his students to examine thoughts critically. Many fears, he argued, arise from imagination rather than reality. By correcting false beliefs, emotional suffering could be reduced dramatically. Friendship continued to occupy a central role in Epicurean life. Epicurus argued that friendship begins from practical advantage, since cooperation increases safety, but gradually becomes valued for its own sake. Within the garden, friendships created emotional security that replaced reliance on political power or wealth. Members supported one another materially and psychologically. Letters exchanged among Epicureans demonstrate remarkable warmth and loyalty, suggesting that the community functioned as an alternative social structure in an uncertain age. Epicurus also made the controversial decision to advise withdrawal from political life. In earlier Greek philosophy, participation in civic affairs was often considered a moral duty. Epicurus disagreed. He observed that political ambition exposed individuals to rivalry, danger, and endless anxiety. Public honor depended on unstable opinion. Power required constant defense. For most people, he believed, engagement in politics destroyed tranquility rather than promoting virtue. His famous advice to live unnoticed did not encourage isolation, but recommended freedom from unnecessary public competition. This position attracted criticism from rival schools, particularly the Stoics, who emphasized duty and civic engagement. Epicurus responded that ethical guidance must consider human vulnerability realistically. Not everyone possesses the temperament or fortune required for political life. Happiness should remain accessible to ordinary individuals regardless of social position. As Epicurean teaching spread, misunderstandings also grew. Opponents accused Epicurus of promoting indulgence and moral laziness. The word pleasure was easily distorted by critics who ignored his emphasis on moderation. In reality, Epicurus warned repeatedly against excess, arguing that uncontrolled desire produces more pain than satisfaction. A wise person measures pleasure carefully, choosing long-term peace over short bursts of excitement. During these middle years, Epicurus became not only a teacher, but a stabilizing presence for his followers. Testimonies describe him as calm, patient, and deeply attentive to others' emotional struggles. He encouraged memorization of key philosophical principles so that students could recall them during illness, grief, or fear. Philosophy, in his vision, accompanied a person through every stage of life. The garden gradually developed into an enduring institution sustained by shared values rather than rigid hierarchy. Leadership emphasized continuity of teaching rather than personal authority. Epicurus sought to ensure that his philosophy could survive beyond his lifetime by creating strong bonds among students and clear summaries of doctrine that could be transmitted accurately. By this stage, Epicurus had transformed philosophy into a comprehensive way of life grounded in understanding nature, moderating desire, cultivating friendship, and removing fear. His ideas were spreading steadily throughout the Mediterranean world, gaining devoted adherents even as criticism intensified. The community he built stood as a quiet alternative to ambition-driven society, demonstrating that happiness might be achieved not through conquest or recognition, but through clarity, simplicity, and shared human trust. As Epicurus grew older, the garden became more than a school. It evolved into a living experiment in philosophical endurance. By this stage, his teachings had spread well beyond Athens, carried through letters, personal visits, and traveling students who established small Epicurean circles in cities across the eastern Mediterranean. The movement no longer depended solely on his physical presence. It had acquired structure, shared principles, and a recognizable identity. Yet with growth came pressure. Rival philosophical schools sharpened their criticisms, political instability continued across the Hellenistic kingdoms, and misunderstandings about Epicurean pleasure multiplied. These later years would test whether his philosophy truly possessed the resilience he claimed it offered. Epicurus responded to criticism not with aggressive defense, but with clarification. He understood that language could easily distort ideas. The word pleasure, in particular, continued to invite suspicion. Many assumed it referred to indulgence in luxury, sensual excess, or careless self-satisfaction. Epicurus patiently restated his position. Pleasure is the absence of bodily pain and the absence of disturbance in the mind. When hunger is removed, one does not need a feast to be content. When fear is removed, one does not need applause to feel secure. His philosophy did not seek constant stimulation, but stable equilibrium. He refined his analysis of desire with even greater precision. Natural and necessary desires, such as food, shelter, and companionship, are limited and easy to satisfy. Natural but unnecessary desires, such as rich foods or aesthetic refinement, can be enjoyed but must be approached cautiously. Empty desires, including fame, unlimited wealth, and political dominance, have no natural boundary. Because they cannot be fully satisfied, they generate endless restlessness. Epicurus observed that societies often reward empty desires while neglecting simple contentment. His garden functioned as quiet resistance to that pattern. During this period, Epicurus also deepened his exploration of mortality. Fear of death remained, in his view, the greatest psychological burden carried by human beings. He returned repeatedly to a simple but radical insight. All good and bad experiences depend upon sensation. Death is the end of sensation. Therefore, death is not an experience of suffering, but the absence of experience entirely. To fear non-existence, he argued, is to misunderstand what harm requires. When we exist, death is not present. When death is present, we no longer exist. This reasoning was not meant as cold abstraction. It was intended to soothe. By dissolving the terror surrounding death, one becomes free to appreciate the present moment without dread. As Epicurus aged, his own health began to decline. Ancient sources describe chronic physical pain, particularly related to kidney stones and digestive illness. These conditions were severe and long-lasting. Yet his response to suffering became one of the most powerful demonstrations of his philosophy and practice. Letters written during periods of intense pain reveal a man who consciously balanced bodily discomfort with memories of past conversations and friendships. He maintained that mental pleasure could outweigh physical pain when the mind remained clear and undisturbed by fear. This was not denial of suffering, but disciplined perspective. Pain, he taught, is either intense and brief or prolonged but manageable. Catastrophic imagining magnifies suffering beyond its actual duration. Within the garden, leadership responsibilities increasingly shifted toward trusted companions. Epicurus ensured continuity by organizing his teachings into concise summaries that could be memorized and transmitted accurately. These summaries functioned almost like anchors, protecting the philosophy from distortion after his death. He valued loyalty and consistency, believing that clarity of doctrine prevented anxiety caused by confusion. The social structure of the garden during these later years reflected stability rather than expansion. It was not a mass movement, but a network of closely bonded communities. Epicureans across regions maintained correspondence, shared writings, and supported one another materially when necessary. The philosophy spread quietly rather than dramatically. It did not promise political reform or cosmic salvation. It offered something subtler but deeply attractive in uncertain times: inner steadiness. Meanwhile, competing schools such as Stoicism and Skepticism were also gaining influence. Stoics emphasized duty, virtue, and endurance within public life. Skeptics emphasized suspension of judgment. Epicureans distinguished themselves through their commitment to natural explanation and emotional tranquility grounded in pleasure properly understood. Though intellectual disputes occurred, Epicurus himself avoided public confrontation. He believed that heated argument often inflamed ego rather than clarified truth. As illness progressed, Epicurus remained intellectually active. He continued writing letters of encouragement and philosophical clarification. In these communications, one senses neither bitterness nor regret. Instead, there is repeated emphasis on gratitude for friendship and satisfaction with a life devoted to freeing others from fear. He regarded philosophy not as personal achievement, but as shared medicine. The final stage of his life approached gradually rather than dramatically. His physical suffering intensified, yet he insisted that his mind remained at peace. According to preserved accounts, on his final day, he wrote to a close companion describing extreme bodily pain while simultaneously affirming joy in the memory of philosophical discussions. This juxtaposition was not rhetorical flourish. It was the lived conclusion of his teaching that mental tranquility can coexist with physical limitation. By the end of this period, Epicurus had demonstrated that his philosophy was not merely theoretical. It could sustain a person through illness, criticism, and the approach of death without surrendering calm. The garden he founded stood prepared to continue without him, grounded in friendship, disciplined desire, and confidence that the universe operates without divine hostility. What began as a young man's discomfort with fear had matured into a comprehensive vision of human freedom rooted in understanding, moderation, and shared trust. The final chapter of his life would seal this legacy and determine how history would remember the quiet philosopher of the garden. In the final phase of Epicurus's life, the philosophy he had spent decades shaping was no longer fragile or experimental. The garden had become a stable intellectual refuge whose influence extended quietly across the Mediterranean world. Communities inspired by his teachings existed far beyond Athens, connected through correspondence, shared writings, and personal loyalty rather than political organization. Epicurus understood that ideas survive not through authority, but through clarity and lived example. And he devoted his remaining strength to ensuring that his philosophy could endure without distortion after his death. His physical condition deteriorated severely during these years. Ancient testimonies describe prolonged illness marked by intense internal pain, most likely caused by kidney stones and chronic digestive disease. In the ancient world, such suffering often carried spiritual interpretations, reinforcing fears of divine punishment or cosmic injustice. Epicurus rejected such interpretations completely. Pain, he maintained, belonged to the natural functioning of the body and required no supernatural explanation. What mattered was the response of the mind. He continued teaching that suffering becomes unbearable primarily when joined with fear, anticipation, or despair. Remove fear, and even pain changes character. One of the most remarkable features of his final period is the consistency between his teaching and his behavior. Rather than retreat into silence, Epicurus continued writing letters to friends and students. These letters emphasized gratitude, memory, and companionship. He reminded his followers that friendship remained one of life's greatest safeguards against anxiety. Even when separated by distance, shared philosophical understanding created emotional security. The garden had never been merely a place. It was a way of relating to others grounded in trust and mutual care. Near the end of his life, Epicurus composed instructions for the continuation of his community. He arranged financial provisions to support members of the garden and the families of close companions, demonstrating how seriously he regarded philosophical friendship as a lifelong commitment. Leadership responsibilities were entrusted to Marcus, one of his most devoted students, ensuring continuity without conflict. This careful transition reflected Epicurus's awareness that many philosophical movements collapsed after the death of their founders. Stability required preparation rather than charisma. His final surviving letter, written on the last day of his life according to later accounts, presents one of the most striking moments in philosophical history. He acknowledged that his bodily suffering had reached extraordinary intensity, yet he affirmed that the joy produced by memories of conversations and friendships outweighed physical pain. This statement was not denial, but culmination. For Epicurus, happiness never depended on perfect bodily conditions. It depended on a mind freed from terror and sustained by meaningful relationships. Even at the threshold of death, he claimed tranquility remained possible. Epicurus died in 270 BCE at the age of 71. Unlike political leaders or conquerors, his passing did not alter borders or provoke public mourning across empires. Yet within Epicurean communities, his death marked the loss of a teacher whose influence had been deeply personal. His students preserved his writings carefully, memorized core doctrines, and continued meeting in gardens modeled after the original community in Athens. Annual commemorations of his birthday became traditions among followers, reflecting gratitude rather than worship. In the centuries that followed, Epicurean philosophy spread widely throughout the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Roman thinkers, such as Lucretius later, transformed Epicurean ideas into poetic form, preserving atomistic physics and ethical teaching in works that would survive long after many original texts disappeared. Through these later transmitters, Epicurus's rejection of superstition and fear continued influencing intellectual history. Yet his reputation suffered distortion. Opponents reduced Epicureanism to crude hedonism, equating pleasure with indulgence and excess. Over time, the word Epicurean came to suggest luxurious living, precisely the lifestyle Epicurus had warned against. This misunderstanding obscured the disciplined simplicity at the heart of his philosophy. He had taught satisfaction with little, independence from fortune, and freedom from unnecessary desire. Pleasure, for him, meant calm stability rather than extravagance. Despite these distortions, his deeper influence endured. During later periods of scientific awakening, Epicurean atomism re-emerged as an important precursor to modern material science. His insistence that natural phenomena require natural explanations encouraged intellectual independence from superstition. Equally important was his psychological insight. Long before formal psychology existed, Epicurus analyzed anxiety, fear, desire, and emotional disturbance with remarkable clarity. His philosophy addressed universal human concerns that transcend historical era. Fear of death, insecurity about the future, envy of others, and dissatisfaction despite material success remain familiar struggles. Epicurus proposed that happiness does not require transforming the world, but transforming understanding. By recognizing the limits of desire, appreciating simple pleasures, and cultivating trustworthy friendships, individuals can achieve a durable form of peace. The image that remains at the end of his life is not that of a philosopher seeking fame or authority, but of a teacher sitting among friends in a quiet garden outside the noise of political ambition. While kingdoms rose and fell across the Hellenistic world, Epicurus pursued a different conquest, the liberation of the human mind from fear. His achievement was subtle yet profound. He redirected philosophy toward healing rather than prestige, toward daily living rather than abstract perfection. Epicurus left behind no empire, no army, and no monument carved in stone. What endured was a method for living calmly within uncertainty. His garden became a symbol of philosophical refuge, reminding generations that happiness may lie not in possessing more or controlling destiny, but in understanding nature, limiting unnecessary desire, and finding security in friendship. Across centuries marked by conflict and change, The quiet voice of Epicurus continued to offer the same invitation he had extended to his first students in Athens: to live simply, think clearly, and free oneself from fear so that life, however brief, may be lived with genuine tranquility.